Here and whilst on study leave, and the seminar is a reporting requirement on the final product of a project and a book that she's co-authored with Will Hout from ISS, Caroline Hughes, who's now at Bradford, and of course our own Dick Robertson. Sorry, I was supposed to say Richard, is that right? In public circumstances. The book is called Political Economy and the Aid Industry in Asia, and it's forthcoming from Belgrade in Mark Beeson's Critical Studies of the Asia Pacific series. Jane's going to talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll open up for about 20 minutes or so of questions and discussions. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Sia, for organising the PowerPoints. It's nice to come and have everything already set up. So, indeed, I'm reporting back on what I did in study leave, the second semester last year. What I'm going to cover in this talk is, firstly, background to the study and to the book itself. The background being International Development Agency's attempts to apply political economy analysis and the research that a Murdoch-based team conducted. I'll talk about the contribution that the book makes to debates around political economy, the application of political economy, and in particular a typology of reformers and reform alliances that is the foundation of the second part of the book. And then I'm going to talk about an illustrative case study, the case study that I've conducted as part of the research, and that is the Asian Development Bank's Failed Urban Services for the Poor program in Metro Manila. This is a slum upgrading and eradication program that failed to get off the ground. So the background is, in 2009, a group of us, largely based here, secured an Australian Development Research Award. Thank you. An AusAid funded research grant, and I'd certainly like to acknowledge Dick's leadership in securing that grant and in herding us over a number of years to make sure we got on with implementing it. So in addition to the authors of the book, Ian Wilson from here was also part of the project, and also a group of researchers at Gajah Mada University, and their research does feature in the book, so I acknowledge their contribution too. Now, the foundation of the research itself was this series of case studies we did in Southeast Asia, World Bank Demand for Good Governance program in Cambodia, the ADB Slum Eradication program in Metro Manila, participatory budgeting in Mataram in Indonesia, and informal sector workers in Jakarta, which was Ian Wilson's work. So as I say, I'm going to focus though particularly on the case study that I was involved in. Now the broader context to this research was what we call donors' political economy turn. That is their efforts from the late 1990s to apply political economy analyses in their policy and practice to try and improve the effectiveness of their programs and projects. And I have up there a list of various endeavours from a range of donor agencies that have been quite prominent in this area. It's not an exhaustive list, but does include ones that are looked at in the book. perhaps, well, really the initial effort came from DFID, so their Drivers of Change program has been particularly influential. Now, what these have in common is really often expressed in terms of an attempt to try and identify underlying structural features of the circumstances they're trying to intervene in regards to good governance programs. So recognising that the outcomes from various good governance programs are influenced by these underlying formal structures and informal relations that are often divided up in terms of interests, incentives and institutions that not only frustrate attempts at change but also can be sources of change. So the whole notion of drivers of change is very important in marking a step where donors are not trying to avoid political processes or bypass them, but rather to engage with them as a source of change. So the DFID, for example, talks about applying political economy to allow more effective and also politically feasible development strategies, to enable more realistic expectations and contribute to better results by identifying the main opportunities and barriers to reform, where they exist in particular country contexts. So again, different publications talk about saying, well, they talk about the fact that it's generally easier to know what to recommend. Donors are good at making policy recommendations, but less successful in knowing how to make them happen. So we put in for a grant to engage with this debate, specifically in relation to how to apply political economy analysis to practice. So this was always going to be a challenge for us to make that step into various policy recommendations. Now, one of the areas that the book covers, particularly in the first section, which Dick and Will Hout particularly wrote, relates to why it is that donors have found it hard to operationalise political economy analyses. And there is a lot of work being done in this area. And primarily we're interested in the political economy of foreign aid itself as an aspect of foreign policy and the sort of contradictions and tensions this produces. Very much aid objectives or development objectives being largely subsumed to those larger foreign policy objectives. But also we talk about the internal workings of development agencies themselves, and Will's chapter particularly covers this aspect. So not only how they conceive of development policy, but also the sort of incentives that are in place for staff of the agencies as development professionals with regards to what is seen to be an indicator of success. And essentially the argument is that the nature of development work means that aid agencies have particular incentive structures, one arising from broader government objectives, so the need to address taxpayers' concerns with regards to proper spending of taxpayers' money, media scrutiny, etc. But also they face the problem that because the impacts of their work, so not just the outcomes, but certainly the long-term impacts, are very hard to determine and to measure. So they're hard to attribute to a particular program and project, but then also it's quite hard to measure, certainly within a short time frame. And so, because development agencies are always under pressure to demonstrate their effectiveness, there's a strong tendency to focus on observables, and particularly observables in relation to the successful management of projects. So really the more limited outcomes. And this forces a very technocratic outlook on their own work. But essentially also for professional staff, doing development then really very much involves the successful management and implementation of projects. And this is what they are evaluated on, and this is how they are expected to succeed. All these factors very much work against staff being able to work politically. So whilst in their heads they may have often quite deep understandings of some of the political context in which they're working and the political issues they face, when it comes to the daily practice, it's very hard to implement. Now, we did get particularly interested then also in the work of what we have called a political economy community, and this comes more directly to the work I did in my study leave in looking critically at the outputs of this community. So what this community is really a whole lot of academics, consultants and development practitioners who are generally sitting on the edges of donors, often are funded by donors to do specific projects as consultants or to run particular exercises, but quite often are primarily located in an independent institute, whether it's a university or some of these allied development institutes. So we've got Overseas Development Institute for Policy Practice in the UK, also the Institute of Development Studies, UN wider, the Asia Foundation, particularly some of the staff in the Philippines have been quite active in publishing in this area, and the Developmental Leadership Program, which has been in part sponsored by AusAid and now DFAT. And I will talk in more detail about that particular program, especially given it was Australian based. And we did have a visit from its then coordinator, Adrian Lethwich, came here a couple of years ago. Now, this political economy community is interesting because it is more liberated, clearly, from some of the institutional limitations that staff that are more directly employed by donors face. But at the same time, it's a community that is very familiar with the internal workings of development programs and development agencies themselves. They do see development as a political process, and that underlines all their work in this area. They have been particularly active in rejecting technocratic approaches to good governance and to institutional reform. And for example, and I'm quoting David Booth here in particular, they have talked about the need to develop best fit programs, i.e. ones that fit into a particular historical and political context, rather than to impose the sort of best practice or the idea of getting to Denmark, that one can transpose best practice into any particular context. So David Booth, for example, does talk about going with the grain and the role of donors in brokering political support for particular reform programs. And he's published quite extensively in relation to work in Africa that he's been involved in. So their work, we would find a lot of commonalities in terms of their critique of technocratic approaches. And also a number have been, particularly through IDS, Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, have been involved and received funding to run various programs or research projects, looking at donors' efforts to promote demand for good governance. So some of the social accountability programs that Gary and Carolyn have recently published a book on. And again, they have been quite critical of these for recognising what is essentially an apolitical approach to many of these particular programs. And I have a rather long quote, but I'd like to just read it to you. It comes out of a book that was published just last year by Thomas Carruthers and Diane Grammont. Development Aid Confronts Politics, the Almost Revolution. And this is a very good book in terms of summarising this political economy turn of donors, but also of this allied political economy community. When it came out, I thought, oh dear, there goes our book. But in fact, I think it's a useful complement because they do have a different approach. And as I say, I'll explain our own contribution in a minute. But what Carruthers and Grammont say is that their criticism is that the focus on putatively universal principles such as inclusiveness and accountability hides the reality of basic ideological choice and contest. So this is the problem with some of these social accountability programs, that essentially they don't deal with that conflict. Societal actors necessarily operate in an environment of competition and conflict without clear lines between what is reform and what is anti-reform, and in which there is not a simple duality of citizens versus the state, which is a clear assumption in the social accountability model. You have essentially the principal-agent problem, and you have the citizens acting autonomously from the state, applying pressure to get it to act as they would like. So development agencies frequently lack understanding of how their agendas fit into these domestic political debates and power struggles, and are reluctant to acknowledge the contested nature of their goals. So I think that's probably the longest quote in the book, but I think we would agree with that kind of evaluation. But where we differ from this political economy community is in terms of their liberal pluralist approaches to state and society, which means that they can perceive the political problem in relation to development reform as being centred on the dysfunctionality of conflicts of interest which stand in the way of society achieving the common good of development. So essentially it's an idea that politics is about sorting out these conflicts of interest in order to achieve development as a public good. So development as a public good means that the whole of society benefits from development, that this is objectively known, and is unquestionably accepted as a good that is shared by all. And so politics is therefore a means to mobilise various political actors in order to resolve collective action problems. Now, collective action problems, as you will know, are quite central to rational choice political economy approaches. And we do spend a bit of time in the book just clarifying that these writers are not simply adopting a rational choice political economy approach, but nevertheless their liberal underpinnings lead them to the view that the essential problem is a collective action one. So a collective action problem is one in which, unless they are otherwise forced or stimulated to do so, self-interested individuals will not act to achieve their common or group interests. So that's a definition from Olson. So it's really about the problem of self-interested individuals acting to achieve those interests, not combining to achieve what are common or shared interests. And it's argued this is particularly prominent in the context of developing countries where institutions are weak. So the political problem is also weak institutions. So whilst this group has a critique of the technocratic approach to institutional reform, they do see institutions as playing a really central part in the development project in general. So the Developmental Leadership Program, which as I said has been sponsored in part by AusAid and now DFAT, and at the moment is still running, was headed up by Adrian Lethbridge until he died about 18 months ago. One of the chapters in the book, we do pay some close attention to this particular program because I think it's probably one of the more interesting ones. It's defined by a very strong focus on political agency, and again, political agency is very much a positive force for change, so as a driver of change, but also stressing very much the need to look at agency in political economy, not just structure. This is one of the points of difference with our own book. So if I just go back to the differed, sorry I wasn't able to get this onto a PowerPoint, but if we go back to the differed drivers of change framework, it involves structures, institutions and agents. So there is a separation there between structure and agency, which seems to characterise some of this thinking. But political agency is seen as providing room to manoeuvre, and the term room to manoeuvre is taken from Merrily Grindle's work on the contentious politics of education reform in Latin America. So she's very much interested and writes very convincingly about the political processes involved in driving reform. So they're interested in reform successes, not just reform failures. What are the processes involved in success, not just failure? And this particular program focuses particularly on so-called developmental leaders and more lately on coalitions. Now, developmental leaders, the term developmental is very much used as a contrast with predatory leaders. So that linking back to the idea of developmental states versus predatory states. So developmental leaders are those who reach beyond their immediate interests to a wider encompassing interest. So already you have the idea there that these are individuals or coalitions that can rise above their own self-interest and promote the broader social or national interest. But these are not just individuals, the sort of heroic individuals who are able to lead followers. Leadership is here understood very much as a shared process and not an individual trait, and therefore one that involves capacities to foster relationships. So developmental leaders are not just simply the heroic individual leader, that can be groups, coalitions, etc. And the idea of coalitions is very important as they are seen to enable the achievement of goals that cannot be achieved by individuals operating alone or operating within their own particular organisation that has shared interests. So coalitions are about working across different interest groups, bringing different sectors of society together. And they seem to be effective in this, in that they enable that coordination, they enable dialogue, cross-sectoral, dare I say cross-class, dialogue in society. And so therefore working politically is about donors investing in these forms of political agency, supporting, looking for and supporting developmental leaders, and similarly trying to broker and support coalitions that can come together to drive reform. But very clearly, Lethwich states, the key political problem is one of overcoming pervasive collective action problems that are at the core of all politics, particularly the politics of development. So that's my emphasis, but and again he's stressing, especially in the politics of development in the context of weak institutionalisation. So agency matters even more in individual, well, the choices that agents make matter even more in the context of weak developmental institutions. So the problem is, again, one of removing the barriers or the disincentives to individuals just operating in a self-interested way, and building mechanisms that will facilitate cooperation and collective action. Collective action very much in terms of coordinated action, not collective action in the terms of mass mobilisations aimed at confronting power, which is the way our approach to political economy understands it. So again, politics is a means to mobilise commitments to resolve collective action problems, ultimately through institution building. Now, this, again a long quote, but it just highlights the sort of approach that Lethwich is taking, where he talks about collective action being the problem of one of irrationality. So you've got the rational pursuit of self-interest leading to collective irrationalities or dysfunctionalities. These problems require institutional solutions, and he gives examples of traffic rules and rules to restrict CO2 emissions as good examples of these. So it's just to underline his focus on collective action problems. Now, of course, there are collective goods and there are collective action problems, but development is certainly not a public good. This is a central argument of our book. Ignoring the reality of conflict associated with development only leads to bewilderment in the face of its manifestation. So what we do in the book is to adopt a structural political economy approach, which is distinctive, we argue, in relation to the different types of political economy that donors and this political economy community are talking about. So it's a distinctive form of political economy, which we argue provides distinctive insights, and we then offer a way in which it can be operationalised. Those who've been hanging around the Asia Research Centre for a while will be familiar with structural political economy. It goes under various terms, also social conflict, political economy. But the core elements are just the starting point that society consists of unequal relations, that there are dominant and subordinate classes. Also in my study, Carolyn Hughes and I did a seminar, participated in a workshop at the University of Birmingham, which was organised by some of this political economy community. And when we talked about classes, it was just about a standing ovation, because people said, oh, thank goodness, at last people are talking about classes. But what I don't understand is why they don't do it themselves. So a focus on those structural inequalities, understanding that development itself is a process, therefore, of conflict and structural change, which produces new social orders involving new ways of creating and distributing wealth and power. And that this is a perpetual process of change involving resource exploitation and redistribution that is contested and fought over by class-based groups. And these struggles are both material, so dealing economic, if you like, but also, really importantly, they're ideological. And this comes through really clearly in the case studies. They're ideological in the sense that ideology clearly links to particular class interests, but also involves certain normative assumptions about justice, efficiency, and indeed development itself. So what's different in terms of Difford's model is that we don't see structure and agency as being different poles of the framework, but we understand how agency how agency is structured in terms of those unequal relationships, but also how agency is a part of that structural dynamic. The other important point, given the focus on institutions in this area, is very much, again, this is familiar to people working in the Asia Research Centre, but that institutions are understood to be contingent features of the social and political order that reflect power relations inherent in that order and operate to promote their long-term stability and hence the long-term ascendancy of dominant forces within them. So generally, institutions reflect dominant power interests, but not always. There can be cracks, there can be inconsistencies, and these can be points at which subordinate groups will try to contest their position. So structure is certainly not simply an obstacle, and donor projects are always going to be interventions in those ongoing political struggles over the direction of the emerging social order. And if we start from that understanding, the need to understand the context which development projects or aid programming is an intervention in, then it's possible to do an analysis of how relevant actors conceive of and pursue their various interests in relation to those particular development projects. So that's the starting point of the way in which we argue structural political economy can be applied. So you need a broader analysis of the context, and from that you understand the interests involved. So, in much of this work, there is a lot of attention given, as I said, to political agents of change and hence to reformers. So we start by saying you need to analyse the interests of different reformers, and that you need to then understand the nature of their support bases, how they understand their own position, their own authority and power, and how they attempt to defend these. And we also make what seems to be the fairly obvious point that those who benefit from the status quo are not likely to be keen to have a strong interest in reform. And normally it's those who don't benefit from the status quo where you will find the largest number of reformers. And part of the problem that, say, the developmental leadership program makes is it tends to still try and look for the powerful and the dedicated reformer, which is in fact probably the rarest of these. So what we've done is develop a particular typology where, drawing on our case studies, we simply categorise different types of reformers and different types of alliances. So idealists are the sort of dedicated reformers that donors like to find. So those are groups and individuals who have a strong commitment to reform. They see it in their interests to support reform. And this can be both a material interest but also an ideological interest in long-term processes of structural change. But as I say, because they're interested in reform, it's most likely because they're not benefiting from the current status quo, or they do not think the current status quo is supportable, and therefore they're unlikely to be powerful. Now, idealists then will form dedicated alliances, and what we mean by dedicated alliances that are dedicated to that particular reform project and are unlikely to deviate from that particular goal. So very much it's likely to be between ideologically like-minded actors. But then we also have pragmatists who have long-term goals of social transformation, but are also interested in short-term measures that can partially bring about the sort of reforms they would like to see. So, whilst so quite often they're idealists fundamentally, but they are prepared to compromise. They are prepared to also form tactical alliances with allies around particular short-term goals. And finally, we have opportunists who very much focused on their own short-term goals of self-interest and whose long-term goals are unrelated to the donors or whatever the development reform agenda is. So it may be opposed to that, or it just may be not connected to it. So their commitment to reform is very contingent, limited and tactical, but they're not necessarily opponents, because we've got the non-reformers, wreckers. Those are the dedicated opponents who see their interests as directly threatened by the reform and will act to try and block it. And then recalcitrants whose interests are not directly threatened but can see some tactical advantage in non-participation. And obstructors who are not necessarily opposed to reform but whose activities would make that reform difficult. Now, we pay particular attention to the pragmatists and the opportunists and their tactical alliances, because we think this is precisely the area that current political economy analyses tend to miss. And yet we see as being extremely useful and important, particularly if they are powerful actors. And this may mean powerful actors in terms of powerful groups, but also groups that are organised among the subordinates. Now, tactical alliances with powerful opportunists, we argue, can offer a chance to implement measures that will fall short of the ultimate reform aim, but nevertheless can deliver some concrete improvements in the lives of the poor and everyone. So, the case study that I looked at was a planned 15-year program in Metro Manila to upgrade a number of informal settlements, or so-called slums, through a mix of financing, technical assistance, capacity building and livelihood programs. Now, local governments have a legal responsibility in the Philippines with regards to social housing for the poor, i.e. provision of subsidised housing, but there's very low compliance. And what the ADB proposed was a model of integrated development in a number of particular sites where communities were established on existing government land that the government had a policy to release to private development, but which under legal requirements meant that that particular local government unit would have a 40% share in that land. So through the process of land privatisation, the local government unit would acquire 40% of that land. And what the ADB was wanting to do is to encourage those local government to have a mix of commercial development and social housing with cross-subsidisation from the commercial development. As this fitted entirely with the domestic legal and policy frameworks, it was seen very much as a program that would be capacity building and one that offered incentives to mayors to get on with their legal mandates. But it's important to stress, and this is the context, understanding how this is positioned in historical processes of struggle, that those legal and policy frameworks domestically were an outcome of urban poor struggle, particularly legislative changes that they secured in the early 1990s at the end of the Aquino administration. And it's in a context nowadays where urban poor have now lacked the coalition strong enough to confront the mayors They have lost organisational capacity since the early 1990s, in part because they're simply confronted with so much happening. So many different projects are happening, they simply can't keep pace. Also, they've lost quite a number of middle-class activists who previously had joined some of their organisations, worked as community organisers. Many of those activists have now been drawn into more professionalised NGOs, or are now working for the ADB, or are working in other areas as employment opportunities have opened up. But also importantly, the ADB has been seen as something of an ally for urban poor political activism, particularly in an earlier project related to the rehabilitation of the Pasig River, where the ADB had sided with a number of urban poor communities against both national and local government, and that had enlarged the political space for their struggles. Now, just briefly, none of the mayors agreed to take up the ADB loans, essentially because, despite their legal mandate to do this, they had stronger financial and political interests, so structural interests in commercial development. So they had a material interest in commercial development, but also ideologically, they just viewed informal settlements profoundly differently from the ADB. And it became quite difficult to have conversations about slum eradication because they just saw it completely differently. They saw it as obliterating slums, not as transforming or upgrading them. So very much seen as urban blight, as an offence to good manners, civility. And this was in line with their own ideology of development as improvement in the social and moral order. Cleanliness, beautification projects. I know this isn't limited to Manila, Jakarta, similar programs, which very much clashed with the ADB vision of integrated urban development. So looking at the actors involved here, the ADB was essentially an idealist here in that it had a particular ideological commitment to a certain vision of pro-poor development. And it sought to have dedicated alliances or partnerships with local mayors and offered various inducements to try and incentivise the mayors to participate in those partnerships. The mayors themselves weren't breppers. They weren't fundamentally intent on campaigning against what the ADB was doing. Rather, when I interviewed them, it was quite clear that they were very interested in courting the ADB. So they had endless meetings with the ADB and would talk about participating, but when it came to the actual decision, they did not sign on. Because they were interested in cultivating longer-term relationships with the ADB, they wanted to maintain good relationships so they could keep open the opportunity to borrow money in the future. They were interested in that. They simply didn't want to borrow it for this particular project. So they were quite opportunistic in their relationship with the ADB, but the ADB kind of missed that. NGOs. There are a lot of active NGOs in the urban poor sector. They are idealists. They have long-term goals of transformation with regards to improving the lives of urban poor communities. but a number of them are also pragmatists. They are prepared to engage with allies around the achievement of interim goals, and on the whole they were pretty supportive of what the ADB was proposing, although they had concerns about the affordability. But the ADB excluded these NGOs. They didn't talk to them at all and were not willing to form alliances with them to try and apply political pressures to the mayors. And as I say, this is in the context where a lot of victories have been achieved, both at the national level and at the local level, by that very kind of organising. And then you have urban poor communities themselves that tend to be opportunistic simply because of their powerlessness and their structural location, and are very open to tactical alliances. So in sticking to its idealist position, the ADB missed opportunities for tactical alliances that affected communities and their advocates were open to. And these tactical alliances might have afforded opportunities to apply some greater pressure to local mayors. By attempting to partner with relevant authorities, the ADB misconstrued the structural interests of those actors, which was obvious from the history of conflicts over informal settlements. Now, the ADB had done a risk analysis and they had picked up the problem of the mayor's lack of political will, but they essentially had no strategy to deal with this. They couldn't apply the insights that they themselves had. So our argument is really that working politically does involve taking sides in conflicts, that inevitably an intervention is a process of taking sides in those conflicts, and that they also necessarily involve various compromises to achieve concrete improvements in the lives of the poor. So we're saying donors can't expect to make major transformations, but they can nevertheless make incremental, concrete improvements that are certainly appreciated by poor groups. And some of the time, the best thing donors could do is probably to take a principled stand on human rights in order to protect the political space that the poor have to utilise in terms of their struggles. And certainly both the World Bank and the ADB have, not necessarily simply by taking a principled stand on human rights, but by endeavouring to have the Manila political authorities abide by their ADB policies with regard to resettlement, they have opened up a political space for urban poor struggles. So, in summary, what the book does is to outline a structural political economy approach, which we argue is quite distinctive in terms of what is already being pursued by donors and an allied political economy community. And we try to demonstrate how that can be used in terms of analysing the context in which donors are intervening. And we have actually developed a little toolkit which some other NGOs and Asia Foundation people, for example, have taken up and actually found it quite useful. And I'm pleased to say that Viti Valenzuela, my PhD student who you know, is now working back in Manila for a development company. And she ran a little workshop using it, and she said the staff found it very useful. So it does seem to enable people to know how to begin to analyse the complex relationships that are occurring to then formulate strategies to deal with them. Thank you very much.
questions? How many people? 1, 2. Okay, we'll take them one by one.
Thanks, Jane. I mean, you kind of alluded to it there. Because I haven't read the book, of course, yet, but you know, you indicated there is a problem with the political economy of aid itself, the industry, of foreign policy, the dimensions of it. I mean, we all know that, or some of us maybe know that DFAT, when it took over from AusAid as the body administering Australian aid, has dropped poverty reduction as an objective of the Australian aid program, but it's no longer an objective of the aid program here in this country at all. How does that square with some of the stuff we want to do there? Because ultimately, you know, there is a problem that is inherent to aid that prevents these approaches from being taken up seriously. Have you given that some consideration in the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem. It's hard, and I think that goes to help explain why Lethbridge, for example, takes a particular approach that he does, because he sees that might be more acceptable in some of those contexts within development agencies to talk about collective action problems rather than, you know, class conflict. So, yes, absolutely. But if agencies and development professionals are to talk about using political economy, well then let's get real and really talk about what it means to use political economy analysis. And if it's not possible, if it's difficult, then it is.
Thanks, Jane. A couple of points. One thing you said during the talk was I can't remember whether you said that public goods or collective goods are, what was it, the phrase you used, not beneficial. I think was the phrase you used, or something along those lines. So you're suggesting that, hang on, let me get it right. Development is not a...
No, development is not a public good.
Okay. So perhaps you'd just like to explain why that's not the case. And there's a sort of an add-on to this as well, and that's just about the, when I was listening to you talk and listening to your criticism of people like Lethbridge, it seemed to me that short of the socialist revolution, the best you can possibly hope for really is to make capitalism less awful through precisely the sorts of things that Lethbridge was talking about, which are well-functioning institutions which are governed by rules and regulations to stop people behaving more badly than they might do otherwise. And so, what's wrong with that as a kind of pragmatic agenda of development? And what's the alternative, comes out of your book, that's based on this kind of critical analysis of these structures? How do you overcome them if that's not the kind of plan that we should be aiming towards, some kind of pragmatic approach?
So in terms of development is not a public good, we're talking particularly then around the assumption that development in the singular, if you like. So yes, I'm not at all saying that there aren't positive, progressive social changes, but quite clearly from the case study here, there are different visions of what that change would constitute, and they're quite irreconcilable. And so that's what you face. You face myriad ideas around development based on particular interests, material and ideological, and they're not reconcilable. So that's what we need. There isn't a singular development project that we can apply political economy to achieve. That's the point. And yet that assumption necessarily underpins liberal projects, because they have that distinction between, you know, the right and the good. So what are the right frameworks, what are the right institutions that enable that fundamental good? And it's always a liberal good underpinning it. It must be a liberal society in order to promote the values that liberals see. So that's really our point. And so yes, for sure, absolutely advocate that there are areas of improvement, but that does involve taking sides with particular groups in particular struggles. It's not about working to the common good of development. And yeah, I mean, I think we understand development, you know, that distinction between development as a process of structural change and development as a plan, as a result of a planning process. We understand the limitations of that planning process in terms of intervening in those processes of structural change. So planning in terms of development, aid, projects, and increasingly is limited. The impact of donor agencies is shrinking there. So that's, we understand that development is in fact essentially a structural process of change, and that to shape that you need to take sides of the actors involved.
So that's all.
Yeah, I'll just add a quick thing, and that is that I suppose the book has been written in response to not only pre-political economy ideas about how to achieve development, institutional strategies and this sort of thing, but against the essentially liberal underpinnings of political economy, where it's assumed that above all these interests there is an abstracted common good. And what we're saying is that there's a range of common goods. Some might be better than others, and you can take parts of them, but you have to realise that whoever you're dealing with has to some extent a coherent common good of their collective good of their own, that is embedded in deeper structural relationships.
Well, my question was about, presumably the authors of the book would be on that kind of idealistic end of the spectrum, and presumably you have some notion of what a good collective good would look like, or preferable one of your own. And my question was about how do you overcome those kind of structural problems that you identify and criticise, and point to other people failing to take seriously. What's the agenda that comes out of your book that helps us to address those kinds of structural problems?
Well, it is processes of political processes involving legal agency struggle, etc. And so again, it's about taking sides in terms of supporting the capacity of particular groups to seek to pursue the agendas they favour.
But there's also the tactic, that's what, if you accept that the people who can help you most, the most powerful people, are often the people who don't want changes, but may in some instances support changes that are, better than others, then the idea is not to seek out sort of idealists who don't have the power to do what you want, but also to have a look at a whole range of tactical alliances. It's a much more complex thing. Some of the people that you may be collaborating with in a tactical way may have long-term aims that are quite different. And the other thing I think is important is that being able to decide what not to do. The idea that there were some ideas that by granting property rights, this was going to be a good thing that could reduce the power of oligarchs, whereas in fact it fell into their hands and reinforced their power. So it's a way of understanding how political economy works that can help people in the aid industry more clearly see the potential consequences of what they're doing.
Yeah, and Sam Hickey's done some nice work on why particular elites might support pro-poor reform. So elites aren't always opposed to it. he looked at some, and so where they think it's not poor people's fault, then they might be prepared to implement social protection measures. So it's not simply about their own self-interest in winning the votes of poor people. There are these clear ideological dimensions as well to how they understand poverty, what they think are the causes of poverty, whether they think poor people are deserving, etc. That are part of that. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to make.
And where they think the elimination of poverty might also reinforce their own interests. I mean, it's not always a case of grinding the poor down to support your interests, lifting them up, might also support your interests. Yeah.
My question kind of follows on from that. It's about the use of the word reform in this. Now, having not read the book, obviously, you might use it in a more sensitive way than trying to make out here. But if you could illuminate this for us. And I'm a little bit hesitant about using the word reform and avoid ever using it myself, because it's often used in a way to try and pretend something that's highly political is actually very politicised. There's two ways this can happen. One is it can implicitly suggest a choice between reform and status quo. So there's a problem, we either do something about it or we do nothing. And I'm not sure if you intended it, but certainly from the way I saw the slide, there was that little bit of that element in the typology where there were these reformers with motivations and coalitions that they could form, tactical, strategic and whatnot. And then there were these obstructionists to the status quo because they were getting rents and they didn't want to see those rents undermined by change. In reality, most situations aren't between continue doing what we're doing or do something else, but two competing wishes of what to do differently. And so that it's not really a case of reform or don't, but reform X or Y. Which leads to the second one, which is often certainly in Western countries, right when neoliberals use the word reform to try and depoliticise the fact that what they're proposing has distributional consequences. So we need to reform the age pension system really means we need to make working class people work for longer, but we don't need to touch the superannuation tax breaks that the rich get or something like that. And so calling this reform, because the way that's used as a depoliticising tool, runs the risk of depoliticising the fact that whenever all of these coalitions are really not advancing the developmental interest, but development for some. And you might take a moral stance and say, well, these are people, they deserve it, but that's still development for some, because it's always development for some. So I maybe handle that far more sensitively in the book, but could you kind of comment on how that plays out?
Just before we do a real that's a long question, I have the same issue with the use of, with your reference to the ABB as idealist.
Yeah.
And what context are you using that terminology?
I'm not sure that we do use the term more sensitively.
Okay.
That we use it really just as a catch-all for efforts to achieve certain outcomes from development programming. So we have been criticised for saying that, so we're lumping in a whole lot of different reforms with different outcomes. So what we might call progressive reform as well as neoliberal reform, etc. So they are getting put in that basket.
You're talking about the process of the outcome.
Well, reform, the idea, reform somehow wants to change the status quo. So they want to produce some change in all sorts of different ways. So that's really how we're using reform. We're not using it in the sense that it's inherently progressive, but that there is the idea of aid programming is to somehow change the status quo to achieve some kind of outcome, and that's what we're using for reform. So it is.
So it's an intentional kind of attempt to make a change. That's how you use it.
Yeah.
Okay, so not
Not as a positive development. No, it's an intentional. Yeah.
So like a local project, in a sense.
How do we make things different, or how do we make things better? That'd be good.
Yeah. Yeah, so I accept that. So the idealism they do want to change the status quo in terms of what's happening in informal settlements. And they have a very clear prescription for that, which they will not deviate from, which includes so while social housing, the whole definition of social housing is that it is subsidised, the ADB is committed to subsidies that are non-market distorting. So they don't like the existing subsidies that operate with a low interest. The government runs a community mortgage scheme which has a low interest rate. They don't like that. So what they want to operate to deliver the subsidy in terms of the land, so that the government doesn't sell the land, it just allows shared use of that particular land. So the point is that the ADB's own idealism, refusing to back down on some of those neoliberal prescriptions, can cause tensions with the NGOs who are wanting more diverse range. I don't care what form the subsidies take, as long as it's delivered there. But also, and this leads to the project that's following on from this, is that is precisely that say urban poor groups aren't quite prepared to take whatever the ADB has to offer, because often it is an improvement on the alternative.
Now, we've probably got time for 3 more questions, and that's how many I've seen hands. So Gary, then Carol, and then Fabian. Let's take the 3 questions and then Jane can answer them, if that's okay. Keep them short.
It seems to me that the theme to your critique of the existing political economies leads to a particular priority in what people should be looking for who are engaging with them. If they're people who start from the standpoint of limited power vis-à-vis those they normally have to contend with. And your phrase about expanding the political space seems to be what that core priority is. So I'm thinking of in response to Mark's question about differentiating between different forms of tactical questions. Am I right in understanding that that is the core thematic consideration in what constitutes, in effect, progressive or positive outcomes from the point of view of those people that are engaged in this process? So I'll give a concrete example. From Mark's position, you would say, well, Freedom of Information Act, that could be a liberal thing where you just have more information provided to people in the market. But it could also be a form of information that can assist in the political engagement, open up the political space to get more information about what companies are doing in particular areas, what their relationships might be, to how contracts are awarded by local mayors, etc. Am I right in understanding that the core political implication of your approach is that expanded political space that are relatively weak is the core objective of this strategic objective?
This follows on from that question. If you could elaborate a little bit on the categorization, the typology, the relationship between what sound like social psychology categories and the structure, the agency and structure, because presumably these categories, the agents shift over time, depending on the political situation, rather than being a fixed and permanent approach. And related to that, then, the question is, if the objective is to open the political space, and if you're successful by committing yourself to one side, the strengthening the power of the poor, perhaps in the case of the urban issue, what seems to happen when that begins to take place is what looks like a new line starts to fall apart. Because, well, in the case of Vitti's urban, and some of the examples that you were referring to, and that we found with land conflicts in Indonesia, where the NGOs have a very strong commitment to collective action, collective ownership wherever it's possible. But the closer they got to consolidating some kind of power arrangement, or the people got into a position where they thought they were secure, it started to fall apart because quite a few of these popular groups really wanted private ownership, and then a new kind of power constellation emerges, and the political economy position that we might have had at the beginning, you presumably have to shift.
Mine is actually not on question as such, but on observation, keeping up with terminology. It's something that's provided me for a while. You define your approach as a structural political economy, and while I obviously understand the importance that you place in structure, you also said that you don't neglect agency. Agency in a way works almost in a mutually constitutive relationship with structure. So at the same time, part of structure. So is there a better term to define these approach to political economy rather than structural political economy? Because when we use this term, it comes to mind to me like a dichotomy between agency and structure, and really also the way I understand this approach, it's not really on this side, it's more in the middle, or this sort of gesture, gesture, strategic relational approach and this sort of thing. So is there a better terminology? Instead of structural political economy, it seems to one-sided to use that.
Okay, so is the priority, the implication of our critique, the priority to expand the political space of the relatively weak? Yeah, but we did avoid, budgeted, what the end objective is. Precisely this links back to the problem with the term reform, because we're well aware that donors have many different objectives, and we weren't trying to prescribe a particular goal, although we might have clear preferences there. But we're saying, well, the logic is if you adopt a poverty reduction strategy, then you want pro quo and work through it like that. So, yes, I mean, I would certainly understand it in those ways, but we're not trying to prescribe particular goals. In terms of the topology, oh look, absolutely, it's a typology, it's meant to be dynamic, and the whole thing about the tactical alliances is that they're shifting, they're short-term, they're unstable, and so, and can be very contingent. So mayors might listen to urban core demands around just before elections, and then sweep them away later. So absolutely, it's meant to be an ongoing tool, and that, yes, changes introduced will change that dynamic. So what Carol's talking about is where you start to introduce individual property rights into urban core communities, then a lot of the collective organising breaks down because they no longer need to organise collectively to defend their property rights. They've got a title. So yeah, that changes the political dynamics in that. And we may bemoan that and say, oh dear, but those households want to pursue that option at that particular time. So yeah. And look, if you could come up with a better term, I agree. I think we proudly use the term structure to just emphasise that. But the reality is, I'd like to just say Marxist political economy. But we don't.
Oh, electrical. You know what it's called?
Okay.
Can I just say, there is one thing in all of this when you talk about performance or whatever, that all development agencies, even where they serve other, foreign policy interests, they still, even as AUSA, they talk about poverty reduction, they talk about reduction of inequality and opening up the chances, breaking down the slums, all of it. They talk about this sort of thing. So in a sense, at least at the level of rhetoric, there is an agreement on what reform objectives are. They might, AUSA might say, well, the best way to reduce poverty is to make more efficient and transparent institutions. And there might be all different ways of doing it. And I suppose what we're saying is you've got to be aware of the fact that this is a political game and that in every agenda there are political interests embedded and that there is no abstracted objective above these political interests.
The implication of that is if you, and it picks up on Jane's response to me, if you wanted to develop a poverty accentuation program, the same one you put in
Well, that's exactly
Well, it's a double-edged sword.
What I was going to actually raise here is that when you do this kind of mid-range theorising that essentially takes an approach that is in its origins a critical political economy approach and you apply it in this context, in problem-solving context, I think, and I said that to a friend that I recently read a manuscript about international sanctions, which is a practice that he abhors, but he still uses a similar kind of framework in order to analyse the outcomes of sanctions. So there is a need, at least in the conclusion, to actually go beyond that a bit, because otherwise that's exactly where you end up. I mean, you basically
Yeah, but
become
this was the challenge
yeah.
we had, so this was what we were doing. So this is not a manifesto
Of course not. No.
for achieving
Yeah,
progressive
but
reform.
what I meant by that,
to a structural relationship.
Exactly.
you know, what I
Yeah,
meant
we had certain incentives.
what I meant by that is not to write some kind of a manifesto. What I meant is that you should point out that if this is how we should understand development and how it occurs and how intervention could occur, then that in itself has implications for people that are doing development in the world, in the way that they should understand their own role, and where they're positioned, because it brings out new insights into how they operate, which then should at least present them with some dilemmas that they should engage. And that's what I meant in terms of pointing out the implication, not in terms of, presenting some kind of a manifesto for how you make the world to be as such,
So if the baddies could get hold of this book and work out a better strategy on how to achieve their aims. But the thing is, the baddies
Okay, folks, we're going to bring this to a close. If you could join me in thanking Jane